Today we're going to talk about the empty tomb of Jesus. This is obviously talking about the resurrection of Jesus. Jesus rises from the dead, and when this is the story about them first discovering that the tomb is empty, which is the first clue to them that Jesus has risen. This isn't necessarily the appearances of Jesus yet. This is just them finding out that Jesus has risen from the dead. So I'm going to go through this talking with you by each gospel one at a time. The first gospel I'm going to talk about is the Gospel of Matthew. And in this gospel, it's interesting. You remember that Matthew is writing for the Jewish people. And so in this story, in this version, it mentions the chief priests and the Pharisees and really puts them in a negative light, reminds us that it was they who really wanted Jesus crucified. It wasn't Pilate necessarily, it was the chief priests and Pharisees who wanted Jesus crucified. So the chief priests and Pharisees, they go to Pilate and they ask for him to send 2 guards to keep watch at the tomb just in case any of the apostles want to steal the body. And so Pilate does that. Then Mary Magdalene and the other Mary go and they visit the tomb of where Jesus is buried. And when they are there, there's a great earthquake and an angel descends, and the angel rolls back the stone to show that Jesus is risen, that Jesus is not there. So it's interesting that however Jesus left, either the stone was never removed, which would be our belief with the resurrection, or that the stone was pushed and then pushed back again, which is more unlikely when we hear the rest of the story. Then the angel is dressed like lightning, dressed as white as snow, and the guards become so dumbstruck, so frightened that they stand there like dead men, it says, basically shocked. The angel says to the women to go back to Galilee and tell the apostles that Jesus is risen and that Jesus will see them there. And as the women are returning, it says that they meet Jesus on the way. What actually happens, what Jesus says to them or what they say to Jesus, we don't know, but it says that they did him homage, means that they adored him. Then the guards run to the Jewish leaders, they run to the Jewish leaders and they report to the Jewish leaders what they saw. And this is again where it's important because Matthew wrote for the Jewish people because the Jewish leaders pay the guards to say that the disciples stole the body. So Matthew wants the Jewish people to know that the story they heard about the disciples stealing the body was not in fact the true story, but that the Jewish leaders had paid the guards to say that story. The next gospel talking about is the Gospel of Mark. This is the first gospel written, and so in many ways it's a very simple gospel, bare bones. It says that Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome, they go to anoint the body of Jesus. Those are female followers of Jesus. And on the way they're wondering, how are we going to remove the stone? Okay? So when they get there, they find that they don't have to worry about that. The tomb is empty, and there's a young man dressed in white sitting there. Again, very similar to what we heard in Matthew. The man tells them that Jesus is not there, and to go back to the apostles and Peter. It specifically mentions Peter, and that Jesus will meet them in Galilee. Again, very similar to what Matthew's gospel said. But here it specifies that they want Peter to know, which remember that Peter is the oldest apostle and the apostle that Jesus has told is going to be in charge once Jesus is crucified and dead. The women flee from the tomb so frightened that they agree that they're not going to tell anyone. Then we hear the story about the risen Jesus appearing to Mary Magdalene. We don't know if this is on the road while Mary Magdalene is returning home, but she goes then. And despite the women agreeing that they're not going to tell the apostles, Mary Magdalene is the one that goes to tell the apostles that Jesus is risen from the dead, that she actually saw the risen Lord. What their conversation is about, we don't know. We don't hear it in Mark's gospel. In the Gospel of Luke, again, very similar, Mary Magdalene, Joanna, this is a different woman being listed, Mary, the mother of James, and other women from Galilee. They are going to go to the tomb to anoint the body with spices. When they get there, they find that the tomb has been rolled away, that the tomb is empty. And there they see two men in dazzling clothes, again, very similar to what we heard, but here we hear two men in dazzling clothes. And the angels, what we would call angels, say to the women that he is not here, Jesus is not here, to go to Galilee and to tell the apostles to go to Galilee as Jesus told them ahead of time. The women go and they tell the apostles, but the apostles don't believe them. Peter is the one that does go, it says, and he is amazed, and he sees the burial cloths in the tomb, that the tomb is in fact empty, and he sees the burial cloths there as well. Then the final gospel I want to mention is the Gospel of John. John, remember, is a little more complicated because his is what we believe to be an eyewitness account. This gospel, according to John, is probably the Apostle John. Now remember, it's not John sitting down writing the gospel himself, but it's very much more probably that he's reporting all of this to someone who then, perhaps a number of years later, writes it down and gives it the gospel according to John, because it's John's account of the resurrection. So here we hear Mary Magdalene is going to go in the tomb, and it only mentions Mary Magdalene. She goes to the tomb early in the morning, and she sees that the stone is rolled away from the tomb, and she runs to the apostles. She runs there, excited and probably frightened, and tells them that the stone has been rolled away. Peter, and it says the other disciple whom Jesus loved, run to the tomb. Now this again is John himself. He's writing about himself, but he doesn't say Peter and I go running. He keeps referring to himself as the other disciple who Jesus loved. And you remember that John is probably the youngest. He probably got a little bit of favoritism by Jesus because he's the youngest. Think about in your own families how the youngest cousin is very often protected by the older cousins. The youngest child in a family is perhaps babied a little bit more by the rest of the family. And so John sees himself as the disciple that Jesus loved because he probably holds a special spot in Jesus's heart. So Peter and John go running to the tomb. John arrives there first, probably again because he's younger and more athletic. He sees the cloths, the burial cloths, but he doesn't go in out of respect for Peter, who is older. He just stays by the entrance of the tomb. Peter then finally gets there, probably a little out of breath because he's older, and he walks further into the tomb. He sees Jesus is not there, but he sees the cloths are there. And note that in this gospel it says that there are two cloths, the burial cloth and then the cloth for his head rolled up in a separate spot. This is important if you watched the Shroud of Turin to remember that there is that other cloth that is a smaller cloth, that the wounds of that cloth match up with the wounds on the Shroud of Turin, but those two cloths were discovered far away from one another, that somehow they had been separated, but when you now put them together, that they really match up, and so are further indication that we believe the Shroud of Turin to be true. The apostles then go back home, and when they're on their way home, Mary stays at the tomb and she's crying, and because she thinks that someone has taken the body. She doesn't quite yet know, even as the apostles don't know. They just know the tomb is empty. They're not really sure yet what has happened. And while she's standing there crying, two angels in white appear, one at the feet and one at the head of where Jesus is buried, and they say, "Why are you crying?" And she says to the angel, "They've taken my Lord, and I don't know where they've laid him." And just as she says that, she turns and she sees a man standing there. She doesn't recognize the man at first. She thinks he's the gardener. Turns out that he's actually Jesus. And Mary says to the gardener, "If you know where that body is, tell me." Jesus says to her, "Mary." And then she recognizes him and replies with the word Rabboni, which means teacher. Here it's very interesting that Mary doesn't recognize Jesus at first, and this kind of is a reminder to us that in the resurrection things are different. Jesus does not look like simply the human Jesus. We see a lot of Jesus's divinity here shining through. And so Mary doesn't recognize him. He's been transformed. And also, I mean, it's not so far-fetched when you think about even yourself as you grow older, that very often you don't look the same. Certainly your grammar school friends and teachers might not recognize you, but as soon as you start talking, people recognize you by your voice. And so here, Mary doesn't recognize Jesus until he says her name, Mary, also probably with a lot of affection, and that's when she realizes it's Jesus. She reaches out and hugs him, holds on to him so tightly that he says to her, "Don't hold on to me so tightly, that I have not yet, I will be returning to the Father." And so he doesn't want her to hold on too tight in a physical way, but he's also really talking more so in a symbolic and more of an emotional way. I'm going to have another document for you as a follow-up to this one, but I just wanted you to make sure that you knew the gospel accounts. It's important for you to read through them yourself, look through these notes, and also listen to the screencast. But hopefully you'll either have read it beforehand, and if you haven't read them beforehand, I encourage you to make sure that you do that reading now before you move on to anything else, so that you get your own feel for what the Gospels are saying about the resurrection of Jesus.